Okay, let's jump right into this explainer of Psalm 55. Today, we're exploring how an incredibly ancient text tackles a very, very universal human experience, and that is profound anxiety and betrayal. Whether you're looking at this from a literary, historical, or even just a deeply personal perspective, what we have in front of us today is essentially a masterclass in emotional processing. It's a raw, completely unfiltered look at what happens when the world just absolutely crumples around you. And more importantly, it shows us how a person actually navigates through that pitch black darkness to find some solid ground again. Right out of the gate, we are dropped straight into the middle of a major crisis. The author is expressing this overwhelming fear and a very real, visceral, physical reaction to intense psychological stress. I mean, just look at the language here. Anguish, terrors of death, fear and trembling, horror overwhelms me. The narrator isn't just, a little stressed out about a bad day. Actually, scratch that. They are experiencing what we today would probably diagnose as a severe panic attack. The text absolutely doesn't sugarcoat the human condition. It starts right in the thick of the pain, validating the very real physical toll that deep psychological trauma takes on our bodies. To really ground our analysis, let's take a look at the source text itself. Starting right up at the top, it's addressed to the choir master with stringed instruments, and it's attributed as a maskil of David. And if you look closely, you can see how the lines are physically broken up on the page, mirroring the natural pacing of a song or a poem. The author is literally pleading, "Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. Attend to me and answer me. I am restless in my complaint and unknown." You can practically feel the architecture of that desperation building, line by agonizing line. Now, here's a really fascinating little detail. That word maskil, up at the top, a footnote tells us it's likely a musical or liturgical term. And what's so cool about that is it reminds us we are studying an ancient musical composition that was meant to be heard and felt out loud. This wasn't just some private journal entry shoved in a drawer somewhere. It was a piece of art. It was likely designed to be sung or maybe chanted, accompanied by those stringed instruments we mentioned. It was created to resonate with an audience and guide them through a shared emotional landscape. When you read these words while imagining a soundtrack of dramatic, urgent stringed instruments playing in the background, the emotional weight of it just becomes so much more palpable. So that brings us to the first phase of this progression in part 1, the cry of anguish. The author says they are restless and moaning because of the sheer volume of external pressure, the noise of the enemy, and the oppression of the wicked. And verses 9 through 11 brilliantly illustrate why they are so utterly overwhelmed. They just stack these negative elements one on top of the other. Violence, strife, iniquity, trouble, ruin, oppression, and fraud. They describe these elements roaming the city walls day and night, filling the marketplace. The narrator even asks to divide their tongues, which really brings to mind a desperate desire to scatter and confuse all this overwhelming negativity. The environment is just completely toxic and claustrophobic. There's literally nowhere safe to turn within those city walls. Naturally, that kind of suffocating pressure leads us directly into part 2, the urge to escape. That intense environment triggers a massive fight-or-flight response, and here the desire for flight is off the charts. We see this incredibly powerful emotional contrast between the violent, loud city and the desired peace of the wilderness. The author imagines growing wings like a dove to fly away and find shelter from the raging tempest. It is such a beautiful, poignant metaphor. Think about it. The dove represents peace, innocence, and in this context, mobility. The author wants to hurry up and find a shelter from this raging wind. They just want out. They want to trade the sophisticated, treacherous city for the stark, quiet isolation of the wilderness. I'm sure anyone who has ever experienced severe burnout or a deep personal betrayal can relate 100% to this exact feeling. But hold on a second. We really need to ask, who is actually causing all this immense pain and chaos? Is it some faceless, generic enemy, or is it a known adversary acting terribly? The author makes a fascinating pivot in verse 12. They admit that, hey, if an enemy were taunting them, they could bear it. If a known adversary were being insolent, they could just go hide. You expect bad things from your enemies, right? Your guard is already up. Which brings us to the most devastating part of the text, part 3, the ultimate betrayal. The lens zooms right past the city walls and straight into the inner circle of the author's life. The heartbreaking twist here is that the source of the trauma isn't a stranger. It is, quote, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. They used to take sweet counsel together, walking side by side in the throng within God's house. This was a shared life, a deep spiritual and personal connection. And the psychological damage of a violated trust from someone on the inside is just infinitely heavier than any attack from the outside. Let's pull up our next source image and see how this builds. We start transitioning from the raw shock of a violated covenant toward an active plea for divine intervention. Looking at the second half of the text, the narrator shifts from merely describing the pain to figuring out how to actually process it. Verse 16 marks a major pivot point. But I call to God, and the Lord will save me. Before they can fully let go, though, they have to unmask the betrayal in part 4, words softer than oil. The text vividly captures the two-faced nature of the betrayer with this striking juxtaposition in verse 21. This comparison hits the nail right on the head. On the surface, the exterior is completely smooth. Speech like butter, words softer than oil. It's pleasant, it's comforting, it slides right past your defenses. But the interior reality? It's war in his heart. Those soft words are actually drawn swords. This brilliantly captures the sheer cognitive dissonance of betrayal. It's that awful realization that the comforting words you were hearing were actually weapons being prepared against you behind your back. After navigating the problem and the agitation, we finally arrive at the solution in part 5, casting your burden. The author doesn't just leave us stuck in the emotional abyss, they offer a highly intentional way out. Verse 17 reveals the mechanism for coping, and it's through continuous, unceasing prayer, evening, morning, and noon. The author says, evening and morning and at noon, I utter my complaint and moan, and he hears my voice. Notice the rhythm here. It's not just a passing, fleeting thought. By setting this specific schedule, the author is creating a reliable framework to contain their anxiety. They are actively choosing to continually hand the trauma over, trusting that they are being heard and that their soul is going to be redeemed in safety from the battle raging against them. Actually, quick trivia moment before we hit the grand finale. Let's look at the word Selah. This word appears right after moments of high tension in the text. In the original, it shows up after that desperate desire to lodge in the wilderness in verse 7, and then again after God humbles the enemies in verse 19. It acts as a musical and emotional breath. It literally forces the reader and the listener to stop, to just sit with the heavy emotions before rushing ahead to the conclusion. It's a completely brilliant pacing mechanism built right into this ancient text. And that brings us to verse 22, which is absolutely the core takeaway this text offers. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. That command to cast implies a very active, deliberate throwing off of weight. You aren't just sitting there holding it, hoping it magically gets lighter. You are actively transferring the crushing weight of the betrayal and the fear to a higher power. And notice what the promise actually is. It isn't that the chaotic city will magically disappear or that the betrayer will suddenly realize they were wrong and become a great person. No, the promise is that you will be sustained. You will not be permitted to be moved. You find your stability not in your crazy circumstances, but in the one you cast your burden upon. The explainer concludes by contrasting two very different fates. The very last verse, verse 23, basically draws a final line in the sand. On one side, you have the men of blood and treachery who are cast down into the pit of destruction. Their deceit ultimately cuts their own lives short. But on the other side, you have the narrator. And the narrator ends this incredibly turbulent emotional roller coaster with a simple, quiet, yet completely defiant statement. But I will trust in you. So, as we wrap up this emotional journey today, I want to leave you with a thought regarding your own life and how you navigate the storms around you. We've just seen how this ancient text perfectly maps the journey from absolute panic and deep relational betrayal to a structured, deliberate resting place of trust. The smooth words and drawn swords of this world, yeah, they're always going to be there, but so is the opportunity to cast that weight off. So take a moment, find your own Selah, take a breath, and ask yourself, in a world full of chaos, what heavy burden do you need to actively cast aside today to find your own peace? Thanks so much for diving into this with me. Keep learning, keep seeking clarity, and I will see you on the next explainer.